The air in the courtroom that day felt strangely heavy, but for Alexander Royce, it was just another stage he had come to conquer. There was a faint smile on his face, the kind of smile only worn by people who believe they have already won the game. His expensive suit, polished shoes, and the luxury watch wrapped around his wrist reminded everyone with every breath that this was not a battle of equals. Alexander sat comfortably in his chair, as if this courtroom were his own office. His eyes drifted toward the woman sitting across from him, his wife, Sarah Royce, and his smile grew slightly wider. Sarah was completely silent, a simple outfit, her hair neatly tied back, and an unmistakable exhaustion in her eyes. She looked as if she wasn't truly present, as though her heart was somewhere else entirely. Alexander leaned toward his lawyer, Michael Grant, and whispered, "Look at her. She really thinks she can do something." Michael let out a quiet chuckle and nodded. "Sir, this case is just a formality. After the divorce, she's only a signature away from disappearing." For Alexander, this was never just about money. It was about ego. He had won everything in life, and now he wanted to prove that without him, Sarah was nothing. The judge took his seat, and the court proceedings began. In his opening statement, Alexander painted Sarah as nothing more than a housewife, someone with no contribution to his business or his success. There was such confidence in his voice that even the people sitting in the gallery began nodding along. With every sentence, he reduced Sarah further, and with every word, his smile sharpened. He was convinced this would be a memorable day, for all the right reasons. Sarah's lawyer, a young and visibly nervous man named Daniel Moore, was simply flipping through papers. His fingers trembled. He knew standing against a man like Alexander was no easy task. When it was his turn to speak, he managed only a few formal statements, sounding as though he himself had already accepted defeat. Inside, Alexander felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Then came the time for the final decision. The judge spoke a few procedural words and delivered the verdict. Sarah was granted only a minimal settlement, and Alexander had no doubt that he had won. He let out a soft laugh and began to rise from his chair, as if the entire process had been nothing more than a joke. He glanced at Sarah and, without words, conveyed a single message. "It's over." But at that very moment, something unusual happened. Outside the courtroom doors, a sudden disturbance rippled through the people standing outside. Heavy footsteps echoed inside the courtroom. The judge frowned and turned toward the doors. For the first time, Alexander's smile faded. The doors swung open, and 3 men in black suits entered. The way they walked, the way they stood, it all felt like they belonged to a different world. Sarah lifted her head for the first time. The exhaustion that once clouded her eyes was gone. In its place was an unsettling clarity. Alexander noticed it, and for the first time, a flicker of unease settled in his chest. The judge angrily demanded, "What is going on?" But before anyone could answer, one of the men stepped forward and said, "Your Honor, we are here only to inform the court." The color drained from Alexander's face. Sarah took a deep breath and rose from her chair, standing tall. Her posture had completely changed. She no longer looked like the silent woman who had been sitting there moments ago. When her voice echoed through the courtroom, everyone felt it. "Alexander," she said calmly, "you think this story ends here?" Silence fell over the courtroom. Alexander wanted to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The laughter that had once been his weapon had vanished from his face. Sarah continued, "You never once tried to find out who I really am." She gestured toward the doorway. "And these men are your answer." For Alexander, this was not just a moment of shock. It was the beginning of his world collapsing. He didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning, and that the laughter he had enjoyed moments earlier was about to turn into fear. The silence inside the courtroom was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a tension that could be felt with every breath. Alexander Royce straightened in his chair, but the confidence that had been shining moments ago was now beginning to crack. His eyes kept drifting back to the three men standing near the doorway. They weren't making noise, they weren't moving, yet it felt as if the entire room was revolving around them. Alexander slowly adjusted his tie, as if that small action might restore his sense of control. Sarah stood perfectly upright now. Her face wasn't harsh, but the softness Alexander had always mistaken for weakness was gone. This was a new Sarah, and Alexander was not prepared for this transformation. The judge leaned forward slightly and said, "Mrs. Royce, the court has already issued its decision. If you have a legal objection, you must follow proper procedure." Sarah dipped her head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement, but then her voice once again filled the courtroom. "Your Honor, I only want the court to see the complete picture." Alexander forced out a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "A picture? What picture now? You already got what you deserved." The arrogance was still there in his voice, but this time it was backed more by anxiety than certainty. Sarah looked at him. For the first time, there was no sadness in her gaze. There was certainty. "Alexander," she said calmly, "you always believed. You knew everything. You never once stopped to ask." One of the three men stepped forward. His name, according to the court record, was Robert Hayes. He presented his identification to the judge and said in a measured tone, "Your Honor, we are independent legal representatives. This matter is not limited to a divorce." A murmur spread through the courtroom. People began looking at one another. Alexander's face had gone pale. "What is this nonsense?" he snapped. "My business, my personal life. This is a matter between me and my wife." Sarah took a slow, steady breath. "Your business has not been yours alone. For a long time, Alexander." His heart skipped. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Sarah didn't answer. She looked at Robert. Robert opened a file and said, "According to court records, Sarah Royce is not merely a housewife. Multiple assets are registered in her name, and she has had direct involvement in several companies." Shock filled Alexander's eyes. "That's a lie," he said, but this time his voice lacked strength. Sarah spoke quietly. "You never asked how I spent my time while you were busy with meetings." Memories began surfacing in Alexander's mind. The moments when Sarah sat silently on her laptop. The times she spoke on the phone, while he assumed she was just talking to a friend. He had never paid attention. To him, Sarah had always been background noise. The judge studied the file and said, "Mrs. Royce, if this information is accurate, this case must be reviewed." Alexander lashed out, "This is ridiculous. She's just trying to waste time." But even he could hear it. The confidence was gone. Sarah continued, "I didn't hide anything, because I thought you were weak. I only wanted to see whether you could accept me, without my name, my work, and my identity." Some people in the courtroom were now looking at Sarah differently. For Alexander, this had become a nightmare. He had walked in expecting to laugh his way out. Now, unease had completely replaced his smile. The judge announced a temporary recess. The sound of the gavel echoed. People began standing and moving toward the exit. Alexander remained seated. Only one thought kept circling in his mind. How did this happen? Sarah passed by him, but she didn't even look in his direction. And in that moment, Alexander realized something. The woman he believed was just a small part of his life, had always been the center of the entire story. And this is where a new turn begins. If you enjoy stories where a woman believed to be powerless reveals her true strength, where truth slowly rises to the surface, and Arrogance collapses piece by piece. Then don't forget to subscribe to Silent Queen Stories. On this channel, you'll find stories that are not just stories, but emotions. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and press the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was softly lit, but for Alexander Royce, everything had already become blurred. The recess had been announced. People were slowly moving around, but Alexander couldn't bring himself to move from his place. His mind was still stuck on Sarah's words. "Your business has not been yours alone." That sentence echoed in his ears, again and again, like a quiet but relentless bell. He had never imagined that Sarah could hold something capable of turning his entire world upside down. Sarah walked forward into the corridor. Her steps were confident, neither rushed nor hesitant. With every step, her presence became clearer. Daniel Moore, who had looked nervous earlier, was walking beside her. This time, his steps carried no panic. He spoke softly. "Mrs. Royce, if all of this is true, why didn't you say anything sooner?" Sarah gave a faint smile and replied, "Daniel, when some truths come out too early, they lose their impact." At the other end of the hallway, Robert Hayes was on the phone. His voice was low, but his tone was firm. "Yes, keep the documents ready. We need to present a clear picture to the court." The two other men standing near him silently scanned their surroundings, as if watching everything was second nature to them. Sarah glanced in their direction and gave a sly nod. They understood. Alexander finally rose from his seat. He felt as though his legs had grown heavy. As he stepped into the corridor, his eyes landed on Sarah, standing a short distance away. He thought about calling out to her, but stopped. Something inside him held him back. Perhaps pride, perhaps fear. He clenched his fists. "This is just a trick," he told himself. "She's trying to scare me." But when he saw Robert Hayes ending the phone call and noticed the certainty on his face, the kind only possessed by people who have everything under control, fear finally settled properly in Alexander's chest. He realized he needed to call his business partner immediately. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number. "James," he said urgently, "have you ever heard anything about Sarah?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Then a voice replied, "Alexander, why are you asking this now?" Nervously, Alexander said, "Just tell me, has she ever been involved in any deal?" Silence filled the line again. This time, it lasted longer. "Alexander," James said quietly, "you should have asked this question a long time ago." The call ended. Alexander stared at his phone, as if it might somehow offer him an answer. Sarah stood by a window, looking out at the city. Traffic moved below. People went on with their lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding inside the courthouse. Sarah took a deep breath. For her, this was not just a battle against Alexa Ender. It was a question of her own identity. She had stayed silent for years, hoping that one day Alexander might try to understand her. But when all he learned was how to laugh and belittle her, Sarah had made her decision. Daniel approached her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, everything will be fine now." There was no emotional rise or fall in her voice, only certainty. For the first time, Daniel realized he wasn't standing beside just a client, but beside a woman who had made the hardest decision of her life. The signal that the recess was ending had already been given. People began returning toward the courtroom. Alexander put on his jacket and took a deep breath, as if preparing himself. But deep down, he knew this second round would not be like the first. Now, he didn't just carry pride. He carried questions. Questions he had never asked. Sarah returned to the courtroom and took her seat. This time, her face looked even more composed. As the judge resumed the proceedings, Sarah opened her file. She glanced at Alexander. There was no anger in her eyes, no hatred, only a quiet decision. In that moment, Alexander understood that this story was no longer in his hands, and this was where the real battle began. A battle where not just words, but truth, evidence, and identity were about to stand face to face. Alexander had thought this was just a divorce. In reality, it was the beginning of the greatest test of his life, when the proceedings resumed inside the courtroom. The atmosphere was completely different from before. The laughter, the carelessness, and the certainty that Alexander Royce had walked in with were gone. He sat in his chair, but this time his back was no longer straight. His shoulders had slumped slightly, as if something solid had been taken from inside him. His eyes kept drifting towards Sarah, but there was no pride in that look anymore. Now, there was only restlessness, a question that clawed at his mind every second. Sarah opened her file and placed several documents neatly on the table. Every movement she made was deliberate, as if she had prepared for this moment long ago. The judge looked at Sarah and said, "Mrs. Royce, whatever you wish to say, keep it brief and clear." Sarah lowered her head slightly, then fixed her gaze directly on the judge. "Your Honor, I am not doing this to waste the court's time. I only want the truth to be placed on record." Alexander shifted restlessly in his chair. "The truth?" he muttered. But there was little mockery left in that word now. Only fear. Sarah continued, "The truth is that Alexander Royce is not merely a successful businessman. He did not make every decision alone. In many of his projects, investments, and strategic moves, I was involved." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge looked toward Robert Hayes. Robert immediately stood and said, "Your Honor, we would like to submit documents as evidence of the claim." Robert removed several papers from the file and handed them to the bailiff, who carried them to the judge. Alexander's eyes locked onto those documents, as if he were trying to erase the reality written on them. "This has all been manipulated," Alexander said. "Sarah doesn't even understand numbers." At those words, a faint smile appeared on Sarah's face. It was not a smile of pride, it was a smile of certainty. She replied calmly, "You never once asked what I understand and what I don't." She picked up a document and gestured toward the judge. "I designed this financial model myself. You only delivered the presentation." For the first time, something like shame surfaced on Alexander's face. Memories returned. The times Sarah had warned him about the risks in certain deals and how he had laughed and brushed her aside. As the judge reviewed the documents, he said, "Mrs. Royce, if this information is accurate, your role was not merely supportive, but strategic." Sarah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, but I never took credit for it. I didn't need to." Caught between anger and panic, Alexander snapped, "These details are irrelevant. The divorce decision has already been made." But this time, the judge did not accept his words immediately. "Mr. Royce," the judge said firmly, "if new information is emerging regarding assets and contributions, the court cannot ignore it." For Alexander, this was another blow. He had believed he was free after the ruling. The chain around him was tightening. Sarah continued, "I deliberately kept my identity in the background. I wanted to see whether you could accept me, without my value, without my name." Her voice remained gentle, but her words struck like arrows. Some people in the courtroom now looked at Sarah with respect. For Alexander, it was becoming unbearable. He closed his eyes for a moment, but running from the truth was no longer possible. The judge moved the proceedings forward and said, "The court will place this case on temporary hold until all documents are verified." The gavel struck again. Sarah closed her file and took a deep breath. Her face was completely calm, as if she had set down a heavy burden. Alexander watched her, and in that moment he realized something. The woman he believed was his weakness had become his greatest strength. He understood then that this was no longer just a court case. It had become an accounting of every lie in his life. And there, another truth became clear to Alexander. The story he had begun laughing through had turned into a battle, where with every step, his identity was being stripped away, while Sarah's true identity was slowly being revealed to everyone. When the temporary hold was announced outside the court, the media immediately surrounded the courthouse. The noise of cameras, microphones, and reporters' voices began echoing through the hallways. For Alexander Royce, all of this was sudden. Just a few hours earlier, he had believed this was a private matter, something that would end after a few formalities. Now, his life was slowly turning into a public spectacle. He straightened the collar of his jacket and took a deep breath, as if reminding himself that he was still Alexander Royce, the man who always knew how to escape trouble. On the other side, Sarah walked quietly with her legal team. There was no panic on her face. In her eyes was the certainty only carried by those who have already made their decision. Robert Hayes spoke to her softly, explaining documents, discussing the next steps. Sarah listened, nodding gently. For her, none of this was new. It was simply a matter of time. Alexander pulled out his phone. Notifications flooded the screen, one after another. Business channels, news alerts, social media mentions. His name was everywhere. CEO under scrutiny. Divorce case takes unexpected turn. Hidden partner revealed. Each headline hit him like another blow. Angrily, he locked the phone. They don't know the truth. He told himself, this is all just speculation. He called his longtime business advisor, Thomas Keller. Thomas, I need to see you immediately. This is getting out of control. The voice on the other end sounded tired. Alexander, I'm watching everything. You'll need to move carefully now. Every word will matter. Alexander clenched his teeth. I don't lose control, he said, but the confidence he once carried was no longer there. Sat inside her car and looked out the window. Flashing lights reflected in her eyes, but she put on her sunglasses and turned away. For her, this attention was not a reward. It was simply the natural consequence. For years, she had hidden herself. Now that the truth was coming out, the world's reaction was beyond her control, and she didn't need it to be otherwise. Alexander tried to avoid the press, but reporters surrounded him. Mr. Royce, would you like to respond to your wife's claims? Is it true that Mrs. Royce was involved in your business? With a forced smile, Alexander said, no comments, but the anger and panic hidden in his eyes could not be concealed by the camera. When he reached home, Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey and collapsed onto the sofa. His house, once a place of comfort, now felt empty and cold. Everything reminded him of Sarah, the moments when she sat beside him discussing plans, the times. He interrupted her with laughter. That laughter had now become a burden. He opened his laptop and began scrolling through old emails. Many of them were warnings from Sarah. Let's review this again. The numbers don't support this decision. At the time, he had ignored them. Now, those same emails had become evidence. He shut the laptop and leaned back, closing his eyes. How did I end up here? He whispered. Sarah returned to her apartment. She slipped off her heels and made a cup of tea. Sitting by the window, she watched the city. For her, this was not a moment of victory. It was a moment of closure. She felt no joy, no sorrow, only relief that the truth was finally with her, and she no longer needed to prove herself. The night grew deeper. Alexander and Sarah were in different places, yet the same question occupied both their minds. What comes next? For Alexander, it was a question of survival. For Sarah, It was a question of direction. She knew this court decision was only the beginning. The real battle would now unfold in documents, boardrooms, and decisions, and from here the story was about to deepen further. Alexander would fight to protect his reputation, while Sarah would move forward to claim her rightful place. This was no longer just a divorce. It had become a shift in power, one whose impact would not remain limited to just two people. The next morning felt like nothing less than a nightmare. For Alexander Royce, news channels were showing his face, anchors attaching questions to his name, analysts debated the future of his company, and on social media, people were sharing their opinions. Some supported him, but most were pointing fingers. Alexander turned off the remote and stared at the television screen, as if an answer might emerge from it. He had realized this was no longer just a court case. It had become a test of his image, his authority, and his identity. When he arrived at the office, tension greeted him in the very first meeting. The people sitting in the boardroom were no longer the same. Where his word once went unquestioned, now there were lowered gazes and serious expressions. A senior board member asked, "Alexander, we need clarity on the reality of Sarah's claims." Alexander took a deep breath and said, "This is all exaggeration. Personal matters should be kept separate from business." But the strength his voice once carried was missing. Silence settled over the room. Sarah, meanwhile, was in a completely different place. She sat in a small meeting with her legal team. Files, laptops, and charts lay open on the table. Robert Hayes calmly explained points. "Your stake is clear here. These documents show that you were part of the decision-making process." Sarah listened carefully, then said, "I only want the truth to come out. I'm not seeking revenge." There was calm in her words, but also resolve. Alexander called his assistant and said, "Double-check Sarah's accounts, investments, everything. I don't want any surprises." The assistant nodded, but questions lingered in his eyes. Alexander felt it then. The control slipping from his hands was not just because of the court, but because even his own people were beginning to doubt him. That evening, Alexander met Thomas Keller. Thomas spoke plainly. "Alexander, if Sarah's documents are verified, you'll need to be strategic, not defensive." Alexander snapped, "I'm not being defensive." Then he stopped. Even he could hear the fear in his own voice. "See," Thomas continued, "you need a clear narrative for both the media and the board." Alexander lowered his head. For the first time, he understood. The story was no longer his to control. That night, Sarah sat alone, reviewing her notes. For her, they weren't just legal documents. They were fragments of a life she had kept in the background. She thought about how she had helped in every deal, how she had spotted risks early, and how her voice had always been ignored. Now that those same truths were coming into the open, she felt no anger, only a strange sense of peace. The next hearing date drew closer. Once again, the media would gather outside the court. This time, the focus would not be just divorce, but power and ownership. Alexander gave strict instructions to his team. "No one speaks without my approval." But the more he tried to control things, the more they slipped away. One day, Sarah opened her old diary. She flipped through pages, filled with her thoughts, her doubts, and her hopes. She had written that she wanted her worth to be recognized through her work, not merely as someone's name. As she closed the diary, she felt that perhaps the time had finally arrived. Sleep became difficult for Alexander. He woke repeatedly, checking his phone, reading emails, wondering where the next blow would come from. The hardest part for him was Sarah's silence. She wasn't speaking to the media. She wasn't giving interviews. Her quietness made Alexander even more uneasy, because he knew silence often hides planning. And from here, the story was about to take another turn. Alexander was trying to protect the ground beneath his feet, while Sarah was moving closer to her rightful place. This was not just a battle. It was a clash of two mindsets, one driven only by control, and the other grounded in truth and patience. The day of the next hearing arrived, and this time, the atmosphere outside the court was completely different. What once looked like a simple divorce case had now turned into a battle where power, rights, and truth were all at stake. Media lines had grown longer, and every camera was waiting for just one thing: Sarah Royce's next move. When Alexander Royce stepped out of his car, the exhaustion on his face was impossible to miss. He was still wearing an expensive suit, but the confidence that once defined him was gone. Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat with her team. This time, her body language was even stronger. She didn't say anything extra. She didn't look toward the media. Her silence itself had become her strongest response. As the proceedings began, the judge stated that today's focus would be on assets, ownership, and contributions. For Alexander, those words felt like a warning. Robert Hayes presented first. Charts and timelines appeared on the screen. With every slide, it became clearer that Sarah was not just a supportive spouse, but part of multiple strategic decisions: investment dates, APR, ovals, and planning notes were all placed on record. Alexander grew restless in his chair. He looked toward his lawyer, but this time, he found no reassurance there. When Sarah began to speak, there was no hesitation in her voice. "I never asked for credit," she said. "I simply did my work." She explained how she had deliberately kept her identity in the background just to see whether Alexander could accept her without any labels. The people sitting in the courtroom listened carefully. For Alexander, every word became harder to bear because each one struck directly at his ego. The judge turned to Alexander and asked, "Mr. Royce, would you like to offer a clear response to these documents?" Alexander remained silent for a few moments. Then he said, "I deny all of this. It's a matter of interpretation, but the certainty his voice once carried was missing." His words sounded weak, as if even he no longer fully believed them. The courtroom took a break. When Alexander stepped outside, reporters surrounded him. "Mr. Royce, do you believe you underestimated Sarah? Is it true that she played a role in your business decisions?" Alexander said nothing. He walked straight toward his car. In that moment, he realized something. Silence was no longer just Sarah's tool. It had become his own necessity. When Sarah exited the courtroom, there was no pride on her face, only calm. As she got into the car with her team, she said to Robert, "This is only the beginning." Robert nodded. He knew the control of the game was slowly shifting. Alexander's narrative was growing weaker, while Sarah's case was becoming stronger with each passing day. That night, Alexander sat alone in his house. Files lay open in front of him, but he couldn't focus on them. His mind was stuck on a single question: how did I miss all of this? He remembered how quietly Sarah worked, how he had always treated her as a side character. Now, that same side character had become the most important part of his story. Sarah, on the other hand, was thinking about the future. She didn't plan any public statements. She didn't plan any dramatic moves. Her trust was only in documents and truth. She knew time was on her side. With every passing day, the truth was becoming clearer, and the space around Alexander was closing in. This time, it was absolutely clear. The man who had laughed in court was now struggling to save his chair and his identity, and the woman who was once considered weak was now shaping the direction of the entire story. The next step was going to be decisive. Both of them knew that whatever was coming next could not be taken back. The day of the final hearing arrived, and this time, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was silent yet heavy. This was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a decision, when everyone knows that what is about to happen will not just decide a case, but change the direction of multiple lives. Alexander Royce sat in his chair, but his face was completely different now. The man who once laughed in court now sat there, with exhaustion and unease in his eyes. His hands were clasped together, as if he were trying to hold himself together. When Sarah Royce entered the courtroom, there was no noise, no dramatic entrance, and yet every eye stopped on her. There was no arrogance in her walk, no fear, only a calm certainty, as if she knew that the truth stood with her. She took her seat, opened her file, and took a deep breath. For her, this day was no less than a battle, but it was a battle. She intended to win, not with anger, but with patience. The judge began the proceedings and announced that final submissions would be heard today. Robert Hayes spoke on Sarah's behalf. There was clarity in his voice and weight in his words. He once again presented every document, every piece of evidence, and every timeline before the court. These were not just numbers and papers. They were the record of a story that had remained silent for years. The judge listened carefully, sometimes reviewing documents, sometimes taking notes. When it was Alexander's turn, he stood up, trying to speak, but this time his words were few. He began, then stopped midway. Perhaps even he realized that standing against the truth for too long was difficult. He said only that he had made mistakes, but not all of them were intentional. There was no reaction in the courtroom, no order, no whispers, only silence. Sarah looked at Alexander. There was no hatred in her eyes, no pride of victory, only a chapter quietly closing. The judge paused for a moment, then delivered the verdict. The court found that Sarah Royce's role was not merely that of a spouse, but of a strategic partner. Therefore, the previous decision regarding assets and ownership was revised. Sarah's rights were formally recognized. As those words were spoken, the color drained from Alexander's face. He sank back into his chair as if the ground had vanished beneath him. He had believed there might still be a way out, but now he understood that the story had truly turned. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment. This was not just a moment of victory for her. It was a moment of freedom. When they stepped outside the court, the media had gathered again. Alexander answered no questions. He got into his car and drove away. For him, this was not just the end of a case, it was the end of a false belief he had carried for years. When Sarah faced the reporters outside, she said only one thing: truth takes time, but it never stays hidden. Later, Sarah sat in her office. City lights glowed outside the window. She sat in her chair and closed her file. That file had become a part of her past. Ahead of her were new responsibilities, new decisions, and new paths. This time, she would not step back. She had claimed her place, without noise, without spectacle, with nothing but truth. That night, Alexander sat alone in his house. He had everything, yet nothing. He realized that the real mistake had not been about money or power. The real mistake was underestimating the person who had stood beside him, but the time to reflect had already passed. Some things do not return. And so the story reached its end. A man who once laughed now sat in silence. A woman who was considered weak now stood with her true identity. This was not just a story about divorce. It was a lesson. Never underestimate those who remain quiet, because sometimes the greatest strength is hidden inside silence. If you enjoy stories where truth slowly comes to light, where quiet people claim their identity, then don't forget to subscribe to Silent Queen Stories. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and press the bell icon so you never miss a new story. This was Silent Queen Stories, where even silence speaks